Hello, everybody, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today for a co-sponsored webinar here co-hosted by Vicente Sederberg and Marijuana Policy Project regarding cannabis policy reform during the coronavirus crisis. My name is Mason Tavert. I am the Vice President of Communications for VS Strategies. I'm very pleased to be here moderating today's webinar, having previously spent a number of years working at the Marijuana Policy Project and now working at VS Strategies, which is the public affairs affiliate of Vicente Sederberg, and working closely with the firm. It is great to be able to bring everyone together here and have a conversation about what is taking place with marijuana policy reform efforts across the country. As we all know, the coronavirus situation has impacted virtually every aspect of our lives, and cannabis policy reform efforts are certainly no exception. They are also being affected, whether it's a state legislative effort, a ballot initiative campaign, regulatory actions in the states. There's all sorts of things happening, and we figured it was a good time to have a good discussion about what exactly is happening, how it's being dealt with, what we can expect to see moving forward. So whereas previous webinars that we've been doing have generally focused on how the coronavirus is impacting the industry, the cannabis industry, the hemp industry, and so on, we really want to look at how this situation is impacting these advocacy efforts to change these laws and create these systems for businesses to operate. This event is co-hosted by the Marijuana Policy Project and Vicente Sederberg. MPP really needs no introduction. It has been at the forefront of cannabis policy reform for the last 20 plus years. It has been responsible for most of the major policy reforms that have taken place at the state level. In the past 15 years, it's been responsible for 13 medical cannabis laws passing or had played a major role in those. It has led 8 of the 11 legalization efforts that have been successful at the state level. We are very pleased to have Matt Schweik and Karen O'Keefe from MPP with us. I will introduce them here in a second. We are also joined by Vicente Sederberg founding partner, Brian Vicente. Vicente Sederberg is a cannabis law firm that has been operating for over 10 years now, has offices around the country in New York, Los Angeles, Jacksonville, Austin, Boston, and of course, based here in Denver. And is really focused on not just representing cannabis businesses, but also on pushing for good policy. We are a proud member of the MPP Policy Council, and so we've been closely following a lot of what's been happening at the regulatory level around the country, and Brian will be talking about that. So let's get started. We'll jump right in. The first area we're going to focus on is going to be ballot initiatives. This year was shaping up to be, I'm sorry, I should have moved forward for that last one. Sorry about that, everyone. But ballot initiatives, looking at what's happening and what we can expect to see. Obviously, there have been a lot of changes as things have been occurring. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Matthew Schweik. He's the Deputy Director of the Marijuana Policy Project. He oversees ballot initiative campaigns. He played a central role in the Massachusetts and Maine campaigns, and also a key role in the Nevada initiative back in 2016. He also oversaw the legalization initiative in Michigan, as well as the medical marijuana initiative in Utah in 2018. And he's been working on initiative efforts this past year, and we're going to let him go ahead and tell us what's happening and what we can expect to see. Thanks, Matt.
Great. Thank you, Mason. Thank you to Vicente Sederberg for hosting this with us, and thanks for everybody that's tuning in. So I'm going to give an update on ballot initiatives, and obviously this has been a huge component of our success as a movement, and that's because it's easier to get voters to approve these laws than it is to get members of state legislatures. And but we're running out of states, which is a good thing. But we're slowly working our way through the 24 states that allow ballot initiatives and making some very good progress. And I'll talk a little bit about this election cycle, 2019 to 2020. So I really just have 2 maps to show you. This first map is where things stood at the start of last year. Where were proponents hoping to run campaigns or see questions on the ballot? And I'll say that all the work that MPP does on ballot initiative campaigns is done in a partnership with New Approach PAC, which is a longstanding organization. We've had a really good partnership for a number of election cycles. So at the start of 2019, as you'll see, there were a lot of potential opportunities. And working my way from east to west, we had New Jersey, where there'd been a lot of legislative activity and talk of a legislatively referred ballot question, which I'll take a moment to explain. That's very different from what's called a citizens initiative. A citizens initiative is when a group of people write an initiative, collect the signatures, work their way through the administrative process with the state and place a question on the ballot without the consent of any elected official. And that's what you can do in 24 states, and mostly states out west, newer states. However, any state can have a ballot question if the legislature places that question on the ballot for voters. That could be a constitutional amendment, that could be a statutory change, that can be an advisory question. And we haven't seen that until now in New Jersey, seen the legislature actually place a question on the ballot for voters. So that's encouraging because we, as I've said, we're not going to be able to get past 24, which is ballot initiatives, so we're going to need more legislative activity. So New Jersey, a legislatively referred full legalization initiative, already has a medical law. And then down in Florida, again, already has a medical law, and there was a desire to push for full legalization in 2020. Ohio, again, has a medical law. And with Ohio and Florida, very expensive campaigns. And then down in Mississippi, a medical marijuana campaign was getting going. Arkansas, Missouri, and Oklahoma, 3 states that had recently passed recreational, recently passed medical, and were potential recreational targets. Nebraska, where there isn't a medical law, the goal was to run a medical initiative there. South Dakota, I'll get to a little bit on the next slide. North Dakota, another state with medical, where the hope was to pass legalization. Montana already has medical as well. And then Idaho, nothing on the books. That was just a pure medical campaign. And then Arizona, another medical state pushing for legalization. As you can see, the natural evolution is to first pass medical, build upon that, and pass legalization. That's just the way voters approach this issue. The levels of support for medical are very, very high across the country, not quite as high for recreational. But by passing medical laws and showing voters these policies work, there have not been a ton of negative effects. I think it helps them get comfortable with the idea of recreational. So this map was the dream, right, at the start of last year. And if we had run all of these campaigns and won them, it would have been by far the most successful election cycle for marijuana reform as an issue. And, I think it's worth pointing out that people look at the marijuana movement and think, oh, they're so well funded. They have endless money from this big industry. They can do whatever they want. Well, as you're going to see for the next slide, that's not the case. Here's where we are today. And part of this is due to COVID, absolutely. And I'll talk about some of the states that are particularly impacted by that, but others, it's just about funding. And, so we as a movement have unfortunately left some big wins on the table for 2020. That's okay. There's other states we can go after. But the point here is that we aren't operating at our full potential as a movement. And I recognize that's hard to do. These are expensive campaigns, but there's a perception that we're just all over the place with as much money as we need. And it's part of my job to correct that misunderstanding. So here we are today. New Jersey still on the ballot, never needed a signature drive. So that's fine. Florida attempted a signature drive. They weren't able to get on the ballot. They spent a lot of money on those signatures. Very disappointing for them. And that's not moving ahead in 2020. That was not impacted by COVID. Mississippi got its signatures in well before COVID hit. And that's called Amendment 65. That is a medical marijuana initiative, as I said. So that's on the ballot. Nebraska, the signature drive is underway right now. I'm cautiously optimistic that we're going to get medical on the ballot in Nebraska, but it's going to be tough. The deadline's in early July. South Dakota is another state that had an early signature turn-in deadline, like Mississippi. So we got both signature drives done there last year, actually. So we've got 2 initiatives on the ballot. Montana, right now, we are in the midst of a signature drive. We're cautiously optimistic we can finish that one off. And then in Arizona, which I'm much less involved in, it appears that campaign's on track to qualify. So I'm going to hone in on two of the states that I'm most involved in right now, which are South Dakota and Montana, talk to you about those campaigns and how COVID has affected them and changed what we would typically do on these ballot initiative campaigns. So starting with South Dakota, the interesting thing about this campaign is we're doing medical and recreational at the same time, which really hasn't been attempted before as two separate ballot questions. Back in 2015 in Ohio, there was an initiative that would have done both at the same time. That was not passed by voters, but in terms of putting two separate initiatives on the ballot for voters to decide on, that hasn't been attempted before. As some of you might think, well, that seems risky in a state as conservative as South Dakota. And won't there be voters who see medical and say, I'll vote for that and wait on legalization? Well, we did our research and we found that voters are ready to support both. There's a firm majority in favor of both policies, and we're just going to need to run a really smart campaign to show voters that these issues go together. And to give more details, there's Constitutional Amendment A, which is the legalization policy that also provides a constitutional protection for the medical law and also requires the state to pass a hemp law in the near future. So that's Amendment A. And then there's Initiated Measure 26. That's a statutory initiative. That's the medical policy. So voters will hopefully approve Initiated Measure 26, establish a medical law, and then also approve Amendment A, thereby establishing a legalization policy, recreational, and protecting that medical law from the legislature repealing it or making changes that make it something that can't really be run in a way that helps patients. And the thing we're doing differently in South Dakota is we're really going to focus more on field than we have in the past. As everybody I'm sure is aware, there's a lot of discussion around mail ballots in this country, a decent amount of misinformation as well. And in many states, the Secretary of State is sending out mail ballot applications to everyone. Applications, not actual ballots. And that's what's happened in South Dakota. Secretary of State has sent this application to every voter. And what we want to do in South Dakota is follow up with those voters. So we're going to start with reaching out to voters that signed our petitions last year, making sure they're aware of the absentee ballot opportunity, and then calling more and more voters, trying to build a list of people who have requested these absentee ballots, and then after the ballots get mailed out, calling those people again, making sure they got their ballot, helping them understand it, and hopefully getting them to vote yes on the two initiatives and get those ballots sent back in. And obviously it's good for our issue, it's good for our campaigns, but it's good for democracy. I'm proud to be part of an effort that's going to make voting more accessible. I'm a big believer that our turnout rates are very depressing, and we need to do things to bring people to the polls. And so I'm excited to do that in South Dakota. And then Montana's interesting. We're doing two initiatives there as well, but they're both legalization, both recreational. The first is a statutory initiative, Initiative 190. This is the policy that will lay out all the details of taxation, regulation, licensing, everything you have in a comprehensive recreational law. That's all going to be in the statutory initiative 190. And then we're doing a constitutional initiative at the same time, CI 118. And all that initiative does is allows the state to set the age to 21. We did not want to do a second initiative. Trust me, we would have loved to do it in one initiative. However, the Montana Constitution says that you're an adult at age 18, unless it's for alcohol and tobacco. And so we're adding marijuana to the list of exemptions for what is an adult in Montana. So that's how we're going to make the age 21 there. Some of you out there might be thinking that's not even good policy. Drinking age shouldn't even be 21. That's a fair debate, but the reality is that voters want 21 for marijuana. That's what's been passed in every other state, and we're not trying to push the envelope right now on the age. So we really think it's important to pass both initiatives. We went to court in Montana to seek relief shortly after COVID hit. We asked a state court to push back the deadline for submitting signatures and also to allow us to use electronic signatures, a program like DocuSign that many of you are I'm sure familiar with. Unfortunately, the judge said no, but the situation in Montana improved quickly. Montana was one of the least hit states by COVID. And so now we have circulators out there on the streets, wearing protective gear, having people sign at tables. We've instituted a range of public health protocols to make sure the signature drive is done safely, and we're sticking to those protocols. And the thing that we're doing that's innovative in Montana is we've built a tool, a web page, which is called signed.newapproachmt.org, and it allows someone in Montana to print the petitions at home, sign them, and mail them back, or to request that the campaign mail them petitions, which is something that we're going to do. Until now, this was never allowed in Montana, but recently was. It's kind of a legal technicality, but rock solid for our purposes. And until now, I think Oregon was the only state that really allowed you to print a petition at home and mail it in. So we are running digital ads. We are doing outreach through our allies. We're trying to raise the profile of this page and generate as many requests as possible. And then we're going to mail out those petitions very soon, call those folks, make sure they send them back. And so those are the two kind of innovations that we've undertaken as a result of COVID. The last thing I'll say about Mississippi is the challenge there's two initiatives. Amendment 65 is the good initiative, and then the legislature placed a competing initiative on the ballot, an alternative called 65A. In my opinion, the goal of this was to cause confusion so that neither initiative passes and the legislature retains authority. We know medical is very popular in Mississippi, but that's going to be a challenging campaign as well. So I'll stop there, and probably already talked longer than I should have. And Mason, should I just take a look at some of these questions in the comments here?
I think we will just get to them all at the end, okay, unless you have a quick response to do you happen to know the answer to that?
To how many states have, which states, I'd have to check on that. All right,
well, we'll come back to the questions at the end, so everyone stick around, and I'm keeping track of any questions that get asked about. Thanks so much, Matt, for the rundown on initiatives. So in addition to initiatives, the other route in which reform tends to take is state legislatures, and there is absolutely no one better qualified to talk about what's going on with cannabis policy in state legislatures than Karen O'Keefe, Director of State Policies of the Marijuana Policy Project. She has been just in the mix, working in state legislatures around the country for years on this stuff. She manages all of MPP's grassroots and direct lobbying efforts, and during her time managing that department at MPP, they've played a leading role in medical cannabis laws passing in 6 states, decrim laws in another 6 states, and as well as Vermont and Illinois becoming the first 2 states to pass legalization measures through their legislative bodies. And we'll turn it over to Karen to let us know how the pandemic has been affecting what's going on in legislatures and what we can expect to see this year and moving forward.
Thanks, Mason. So my world is state legislatures, and about half of the states in the country don't have a ballot initiative process. So there's no opportunity for citizens to collect signatures and put something on the ballot and decide it themselves. The only way to legalize marijuana or to pass medical marijuana in about half the country is if state lawmakers and the governor are convinced to do so. And we were hoping going into this year that we would have a banner year with the most states legalizing marijuana legislatively ever. And that would have been a grand total of 2 or more. So far, there's only been 1 state in a given year, Illinois and Vermont, that have passed. It's a slow process. There are a lot of opportunities for it to be killed at the committee process, and you have to get every single vote with very cautious lawmakers. So the pandemic has unfortunately derailed a couple of bills that had a very solid chance of passing were it not for everything grinding to a halt. In Connecticut last year, we got legalization through 3 different committees. It was ready for a floor vote, but we didn't have the House floor votes, enough votes in the House. And we were making a lot of progress and had a lot of optimism that we'd be able to get there this year. But the legislative sessions in most states run from basically January until mid-spring or late spring in most states. So the time that lockdown started was right when you start to get floor votes, And then what a lot of states did is they just halted their session for a few weeks, and then they ended up adjourning, other than having a couple of things related to COVID in most cases. So that's what happened with Connecticut. We never got to have a floor vote. No policy bills, for the most part, got to have floor votes. They might have a special session later on, but it'll be focused largely on, or solely on, coronavirus-related issues and completely non-controversial ones. The other state that was derailed the most for legalization because of the coronavirus was New York. In that state, the governor, Cuomo, had put legalization in his proposed budget 2 years in a row. There was a lot of optimism that it would pass on April 1st, and it ended up, of course, that New York was the most hit state in the country with the coronavirus, and they weren't able to work out the details in time. There's a tiny sliver of hope that it could still end up passing, but it's far less likely, and it was widely acknowledged that the best bet was to wrap legalization into a larger budget issue. However, there actually are still a couple of legalization efforts that are possible. States, legislatures in a few cases have continued meeting. Some are doing so by Zoom, like Vermont. In New Hampshire, they're planning on coming back and meeting in a hockey stadium for the House, and in the Senate, in the House chambers for the Senate. So they are going to find a way to vote on bills in both of those states. In Vermont, we'd already legalized possession and cultivation through the legislature, but the governor was opposed at that time to including sales. It was studied, they came back with a report, and now we are working on adding legal regulated sales. Both chambers passed the bill. A conference committee was appointed right before the legislature shut down, and now they're working on the details and expected to come back in August. So we're hopeful that they can finish the job in Vermont this year. In New Hampshire, the House, which has 400 members and every single bill gets a floor vote, had already passed legalization through the House with, I believe, a veto-proof majority. The Senate has always been the tougher chamber, but we thought we finally had the votes to pass the Senate. So we might be able to get that past the Senate as well. The governor is a prohibitionist, so it may or may not become law, even if it gets through the Senate. But this year is an election year, and we'd only have to move about 3 Senate seats to supporters to have a veto-proof margin. So that is somewhere that we're particularly interested in and involved in, and hope to see at least a bill get to the governor this year. Next up on the larger horizon, there are a lot of states that could pass legalization legislatively next year. Chances are only a handful of these will do so. There's a number of factors. Like I said, there are so many opportunities in every state for the process to get slowed down. It often takes more years than we would like. Limited resources are always a challenge. But in all the states on the left, Connecticut, which I discussed, Delaware, Maryland, New Hampshire, New York, New Mexico, Rhode Island, and Virginia, there's a real possibility that legalization can pass legislatively there as well. I'll go through them very quickly, the ones I haven't mentioned yet. In Delaware, we need a supermajority of 60% in both chambers. That's what's required for anything with fees and taxes. We did get a simple majority in the House before, and each election year we tend to get more supportive lawmakers. They tend to be younger, they tend to realize where the public is on this more, and just natural evolution of where people stand on legalization helps us each election year. In Maryland, there is a study commission, a legislatively enacted study commission that is supposed to report back by the end of the year on legalization. Once they do so, the hope is that they will go ahead and legalize and regulate marijuana. I mentioned New Hampshire and New York. New Mexico's House, I believe it is, has passed legalization, but it did not have the votes in a Senate committee this year. A couple of those seats have primary challenges. A couple of Democrats have voted no. And with changes in the election, it's possible. And even without changes in the election, given financial pressures that states are facing, it's possible. In Rhode Island, the governor has long been a champion. The leadership in both chambers have kind of gone back and forth. It's also a state that could be possible. In Virginia, the legislature decriminalized up to an ounce of marijuana and enacted a $25 fine this year. That included in the bill a study commission on legalization that is to report back by this November. So that is a possibility as well, although in most states it does take somewhat longer, especially if there's a shoestring budget. The next two are states where there could be a chance, but it's highly unlikely unless one or both legislative chambers flip to the Democrats. In Minnesota, the Senate Republicans are staunchly opposed. That could change, but so far there's no sign it will. But the Senate has only a few seats that would need to flip for the Democrats to be in control, and the Democratic leader in the Senate is supportive, as is the House leadership, as is the governor. And in Pennsylvania, it's a similar situation. So far, Republican leadership has been adamantly opposed, although a couple of Republicans have publicly said they should discuss legalization. The governor supported it's in play too, so it's another one to watch. Turning to medical cannabis, it was very sad to see the 3 states on the left, Alabama, Kentucky, and South Carolina's medical cannabis bills die this year because of the coronavirus. In both Alabama and Kentucky, one of the legislative chambers had passed medical cannabis by more than a 2-to-1 margin. There was strong reason to think the other chamber would do so as well. This was in the middle of March, and then of course they stopped meeting. They only met a couple of days on the budget or similar issues, and they ended up adjourning without addressing other policy issues. In South Carolina, it was a similar situation, but it was committees that had on both chambers had scheduled meetings on the medical cannabis bills. Our internal vote count indicated we had the votes in both the House and the Senate if we got a floor vote. And again, they adjourned because of social distancing requirements. Next year in 2021, all 3 of those states could be in play. And there are a lot of other states that with a robust campaign could very well enact a medical cannabis bill, but so far there hasn't been one. And there are a lot of states that are very close to what we would count that have low THC laws with access and that otherwise could just have their laws amended to be closer to a comprehensive law. So stepping back to how you all and others can get involved to help pass these laws, the easiest thing to do is just to shoot a quick email or a phone call to your lawmaker. We have 66% support nationwide for legalization, but this is still an issue that lawmakers are hesitant to take a vote on. The people that show up at their coffee hours that get the most involved tend to be more conservative, tend to be older, which tends to have lower support for legalization. So the more active supporters that show up at coffee hours, that are polite and that are involved in the community and that contact them, even emails and phone calls make impact, but certainly the more engaged supporters, the better. Signing up to our email alerts at that link is a way to keep updated. We'll let you know when a bill is moving in your state, so you can send an email or make a phone call or post it to social media. In those states that we're running legalization or medical campaigns, we often have state coalitions, which you'll find out about at our state websites too. And there are often a lot of other opportunities to get involved. We're always looking especially for people like former law enforcement or clergy or medical professionals or anyone with a special connection to the issue. We'll be sending out voter guides in all of the electoral states that we are most involved in, where we'll have a questionnaire that'll go out to candidates, ask them where they stand on our issues, and then we'll send out a voter guide saying how they responded and how they voted in the past. Of course, electing supporters is really important, so getting involved in elections is very helpful. In a lot of these state legislative districts, there are very few people that are actively campaigning for lawmakers. So volunteering to go door to door, if that happens, or to make phone calls or making a donation can really show that this is something that active supporters care about, and we certainly would encourage you to do so. And then there's a lot of other ways to get involved too. If you plug in with us, I saw in the comments that Barb Brohl is listening. She was kind enough to submit some written testimony in a couple of states. She was a former regulator in Colorado. Anyone with a particular connection to the issue, now if you're a business owner that has contributed a lot to the community, or a local official who can say how medical cannabis or legalization has helped grow the economy, we'll be looking to gather stories concretely about how these jobs in communities are benefiting people, because with the coronavirus, so many people have lost their jobs, and we think that kind of developing the narrative will be very helpful in showing the stories of how this is growing the economy, and helping communities will be really helpful, in addition to having stories from people like law enforcement and doctors to kind of refute a lot of the stuff our opponents say. And of course, donations are really, really helpful. There are more states that we could pass laws in than we have the funding to do so in. There are states where if we had a lobbyist, an organizer, we could have a very good chance of passing, but with just shoestring staff spending a little bit of their time on that, many other states, we can't take advantage of all of the opportunity there is. So if you could support our work too, that would always be appreciated. And that's it for me for now.
Thank you very much, Karen. Appreciate your insights into all that. Still sounds like there's quite a bit going on. So moving along, we are going to get into some of the regulatory matters that have come up, what's been changing during the pandemic, and whether these changes will be temporary or whether we can expect to see them stick around, what other changes they might inspire. And to talk on this subject is my very good friend and associate, Brian Vicente. He is the founding partner of Vicente Sederberg. Vicente Sederberg has been incredibly involved in regulatory matters and policy matters around the country and really around the world, working with officials and really helping them understand how these laws need to work and how these businesses operate and making sure that these systems are working the way they should. Brian has been working with marijuana businesses on every aspect of this industry for the last 15 years. With VS for the last 10. He's advised national, state, and local officials on the development of regulated cannabis markets. He was a lead drafter of Colorado's Amendment 64, as well as a co-director of that campaign. He's been ranked a Band 1 cannabis lawyer by Chambers and Partners and named a cannabis law trailblazer by the National Law Journal. And he's going to tell us about what's going on with state regulatory matters in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. Brian.
Yeah. Thanks, Mason. Yeah, and we've had some, honestly, just fascinating regulatory shifts in the last 3 months, things that we thought were perhaps impossible, and now states have really jumped on board with. I did want to begin by saying a little bit, Mason spoke about, our law firm speaks to elected officials across the country. Just today I was on the phone with Johnson County, Iowa elected officials. Last week we were talking to folks in the Virgin Islands, and we're really hearing something completely fascinating, and that really speaks to the opportunity in front of us and why activists and interested parties on the phone should really be paying attention right now, as we have an unprecedented opportunity to, I think, accelerate marijuana reform movement. And I think that's for two reasons, right? One is when I'm talking to elected officials across the country, they are saying they are in dire need of funding. Just dire need. COVID has really cut out the legs from a lot of local and state budgets, and they're looking for new lines of revenue. And we've got a new line of revenue for them, cannabis businesses, whether it's medical or expanding their recreational businesses or what have you. So they're really primed to speak about that. The other reason is we have an unparalleled level of screen time in this country right now. People are not doing in-person meetings. Many legislators are not meeting in person. So that, if you send an email now to your elected officials saying, hey, MPP can provide resources, or have you thought about this fact? Did you know that the cannabis economy was $13 billion last year, and cannabis jobs have been declared essential in 30 some states? Elected officials are much more likely, I think, to read those, right? So I'll speak a little more about that. But the path forward here, I think, is really interesting. And let me jump into some of the regulatory shifts we've seen. So, for those of us who have been working on this issue for a while, you go back 20 years and there were no legal marijuana businesses, right? It was all illegal. And then really on the last 15 or so have we had I'd say robust or state recognized businesses that are licensed. And to go from essentially illegal businesses to now businesses that have been judged as essential is simply remarkable. It's remarkable progress, and I think it speaks to where this industry is headed and the impact it's playing in the community. And also, if there is a prolonged effect of this pandemic or God forbid, a future pandemic, the fact that cannabis businesses have already been deemed essential by conservative governments and liberal governors across the country, I think bodes well for them continuing to be considered, important businesses in our communities. So, what we've seen in the past 3 months has been phenomenal. A lot of this, I think, started in Michigan, right? Those of us that work with hundreds of marijuana businesses across the country. We're like, oh my God, what's going to happen in these states? Are these businesses going to be deemed essential or not? Michigan and Colorado kind of flew up their flag right away and said, these are essential businesses. And many, many other states sort of jumped on board. So starting with medical marijuana, every single state that has medical cannabis has allowed medical cannabis businesses to be deemed essentially essential and continue sales. And really, as someone that was advocating and lobbying state governments on this and local governments, they got it. our number one point was we can't have patients not have access to medical marijuana. We can't, right? The same way they have to be able to go to a pharmacy, they have to be able to go to a medical dispensary, and regulators across the board got it. Right. So I really was thrilled about that. So really great progress there. And they also understood the supply chain, right? Supply chain. You can't just have dispensaries open, but not have the producers, the growers, and the manufacturers declared essential too, right? Then the supply chain shuts down, patients don't get medicine. Bad policy. So we were able to protect all three of those types of businesses. Shifting to adult use, so our recreational states, essentially 12 of the 13 states jumped on board and said that, these are essential businesses as well. We thought that was positive. Our messaging after we sort of addressed the patient issue, we then our fallback was sort of, these are jobs in the community. We want to make sure patients that aren't qualifying under the medical program or choose to go to recreational stores can still go there. Of course, we want to make sure, people are going to buy cannabis regardless. So we want to make sure we're minimizing black market transactions. If you shut down all the recreational stores, what's going to happen? There'll be a lot more hand-to-hand drug deals. So, and regulators by and large got that, right? So that was really, we felt great about that. Unfortunately, Massachusetts was the one standout. They did not allow their recreational stores to remain open. They did allow liquor stores to remain open. We sued them along with some other individuals in Massachusetts. We sued the governor, Charlie Baker. We did not win, and they ultimately decided that within the sort of public health crisis that he had certain powers that would allow him to make these designations about what's essential and not. But I am happy to announce that as of 2 days ago, Massachusetts is now allowing recreational sales again. It's only via curbside, and I'll kind of talk about what that means. And I like to think our lawsuit pushed him along the way there. And then Nevada, which is, fascinating economy, has been really, I think, a great example of how marijuana businesses can be well regulated. Of course, it's been decimated by the lack of tourism. So they originally only allowed a delivery, but now I believe they've opened up sort of in-person and curbside as well. And I did want to notice, two kind of facts regarding sales. What we found is consumers are actually purchasing less frequently, right? So they're abiding by their stay-at-home orders, but when they do purchase, they're buying a lot more. Right. And this has led to a positive bump from March of 2019 to March of 2020 in a number of states in their overall sales. So in particular in Arizona, Colorado, Oregon, and Maryland have all seen larger sale numbers during the pandemic, March 2020, than they did in March 2019. So just really interesting kind of market developments going on. Shifting to other state regulatory responses, delivery, right? Of course, we feel like patients certainly shouldn't have to wait in line to get medical marijuana, and we don't feel recreational customers should either. So prior to COVID, delivery was allowed in some way, shape, or form in 15 states, and then once COVID hit, we had 5 new states jump on board. And between this and curbside, which I'll talk about in a minute, this is something that myself and allies like myself that are working on this issue for a while, you run into legislators that say, we'll never pass delivery, or we'll never do this, we'll never do that. Well, they did it in like a week when it came down to it. We got a number of states to move forward because of this public health crisis. And so we have Delaware now allowing delivery, DC allowing delivery, Louisiana, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and Utah. Louisiana temporarily, but perhaps that'll remain in place after COVID, and they've made some other positive steps in their program down there as well. And then just another regulatory shift has been positive. Minnesota and Pennsylvania have both allowed temporary caregivers to serve, basically caregivers to serve an unlimited number of patients. Most medical marijuana laws are structured so you have caregivers, which are kind of flesh and blood individuals, not stores, that can provide medicine to sick people, and those states rightfully expanded those laws. So we salute them. The next slide, Curbside, this has been fascinating. So again, we talk to regulators all the time and try to say, oh, curbside might make sense. It's better for the consumer. And they would say, no, never, it's impossible. Well, 28 states passed curbside in a matter of 2 weeks, right? So again, when the pressure's on, states can really move forward on positive marijuana policy. Curbside, in short, is basically an individual at home, right, in the safety of their own home, ordering marijuana via online or via telephone. We find telephones actually probably more common in these spaces because it's most folks just don't have their online delivery system set up because it's such a new law. And then either paying online or going to the facility itself and picking up the marijuana, usually curbside, literally, or within the store. And sometimes payment will be facilitated there, sometimes not. But of course, you have less lines and less wait time, things of that nature. This has been a fascinating regulatory development because one of the main foundations of any marijuana law is that marijuana sales need to take place within the four corners of the building that is regulated, right? And curbside kind of throws that out the window, right? If you can go out to the parking lot. Now, there are still requirements that transaction occur under camera. And of course, there are cameras in marijuana dispensary parking lots. And that transaction still needs to be logged into the point of sale system, the seed to sale tracking system, and all that good stuff. But that is just a fascinating development that the states just said, all right, never mind, we're going to allow curbside for public health reasons. And I think that was really smart. One other issue is just telemedicine. In the early days, we advocated for telemedicine basically for like rural patients or patients that were lived in the country. And when most of the medical marijuana doctors were in the cities, we just didn't want patients to feel like they had to get on the bus for 4 hours to head to see the doctor. They should be able to do it via telemedicine. We're successful in getting some of those laws passed. But of course, now it's taken on a whole new light, right? Patients anywhere don't want to be standing in a waiting room and should have quicker access to doctors. And fortunately, 12 states have expanded or newly allowed telemedicine. So that's really positive. Massachusetts and Michigan specifically are now allowing initial medical marijuana appointments. So like your initial recommendation as opposed to renewals, which is great. And then, Massachusetts, the fact that I referenced earlier that they shut recreational stores, that led to a glut of folks trying to become medical marijuana patients so they can have safe access. And that's just sort of remarkable how that occurred. So, let's see. One or two final kind of things here, just, state regulatory response to some other things, the easing of red tape, we've seen, a number of states expand expiration dates for patient cards, caregiver cards, employee badges. Those often need to be renewed every year or what have you. They've gone ahead and extended those expirations so that people don't have to stand in line, which is very smart. Easing restrictions on new hires, as we've seen, with 15% or so of Americans unemployed right now. Marijuana companies are hiring like never before. Right. And states have been thoughtful about making sure that they get qualified employees through the door quicker and easing some of the restrictions around that. Washington is, essentially allowing minors to come in to purchase medicine, which is a positive thing. And then, for the business owners that may be watching, for years we've been asking Denver politely to allow for online renewals. They assured us that was impossible, would never happen. They did it within a week when this happened, and now we're allowing online renewals and extensions. So it's funny what these crises will sort of bring out. So I guess to sort of conclude, where is this going to go? Are they going to put the genie back in the bottle? I think a lot of these measures that have been passed under COVID have been smart. They will remain law moving forward. I have a difficult time thinking that they would reverse some of these public policies. But I did want to, again, just encourage individuals. Now is the time for you to get involved with your local electeds, to support MPP, and to really show that cannabis can be one of the factors that helps lead our country out of this economic depression, through the jobs and tax revenue that it will be generating in the future. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Mason. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. All very interesting stuff. Obviously, a lot of things are happening at the state level. As you can see here on your screen, there are some resources available to you. Vicente Sederberg has a resource center on its website. If you just go to vicentesederberg.com, big red bar across the top, all you have to do is click on it, and we've got state regulatory updates, a very exhaustive look at all of the federal relief bills, FAQs about those bills and how they impact cannabis and hemp businesses, tips for businesses ranging from, social distancing guidelines, to really how to deal with an economic downturn, and of course an archive of webinar episodes if you care to go back and watch this one again because it was so good. And MPP also has some great resources. If you check out their website, you just go to mpp.org/coronavirus. They are closely tracking what's happening in the states as well. If you want to know which states are allowing curbside, which states are allowing delivery, and so on and so forth, you can find all of that information at these two places. With that, we're going to go ahead and take some of the questions that have come in. A couple of them have been answered here in the chat. There was a question about what's happening in Kentucky, and I saw that, Karen addressed Kentucky during her presentation, so I think we've got that one covered. Someone asked about Idaho. Matt had responded in the chat to that one. They apparently came up short on their signature drive. It was just not possible due to the coronavirus. There was also a question, I don't know, is Matt still on? Can't see, there you go. We had a question about whether there were any lessons learned from the Oklahoma and Utah medical marijuana campaigns, which were successful, and whether there were any specific lessons there, and how those might be getting applied.
I think the biggest lesson from those two was a simple one, that you can pass medical anywhere, right? And that's medical can win in any state in the country. That was my takeaway from Utah. I think the one other additional, more specific lesson is in a conservative state like Utah, where the church is a major factor. I think we learned some things in terms of political outreach in a religious context, and trying to make the case to Mormons that this was a compassionate policy. And I think we learned things that could be helpful in other conservative states where religion plays a bigger role in life. And the last thing, we ended up making a deal in Utah, right? At the end, we all stood down and agreed on an amended law. And so I think that's a helpful model for future campaigns. If we can do a ballot initiative, but then come to an understanding with the legislature and have a deal, that's good for patients, right? That implements the policy quicker. So those are some of the things I picked up from Utah.
Great. We had a question referencing some of the talking points we tend to hear from opponents, citing traffic accidents, crime, and so on, and asking what we now know about changes in those types of statistics, whether they're better or worse in states that have legalized medical and recreational sales.
Karen.
I think all three of these people have paid me to answer that question for them. So I don't know if I'm supposed to or not at this point.
Go ahead.
I'll go. Ultimately, we what we know is that these laws do not in any way appear to be contributing to increases in these types of social problems. That's not to say that there aren't still traffic accidents, that there aren't some that might involve cannabis, but due to a lack of good data prior to legalization in most of these states, it's really difficult. And most of these state governments, like Colorado's government, has very strongly warned people against making before and after comparisons based on not having a lot of the data they used to have before, and now that they're collecting. Before they used to just look at, for example, in Colorado, they only looked at traffic accidents involving alcohol and traffic accidents involving drugs. And they didn't really even separate it out when it was someone with cannabis and alcohol. Now they're starting to tease all that information out. But even then, what we're finding is state officials are saying they're not seeing any sort of dramatic or significant changes, and nothing that can be attributed to these things. So, for anyone who's arguing with opponents about this, it's really important not to necessarily argue that legalization is reducing crime or legalization is not tied to an increase in traffic accidents, but to point out that there is no evidence that legalization has contributed to greater problems in any of these states, while there is evidence that it's contributing to all sorts of benefits, whether it's jobs, tax revenue, and so on. So
I'd like to throw on one talking point
Please.
that I think is really compelling on this. 11 states have legalized marijuana for adults. None of them have repealed it. And none of those states has a repeal bill even made it to the floor of a House or a Senate, let alone pass a chamber. And none of these states has a repeal of legalization ballot initiative, even started collecting signatures. So, my point to people when I'm talking in South Dakota, Montana is, if our opponents were right, if they were even 10% right, wouldn't we see at least some repeal activity somewhere? Instead, we see none. And what that tells you is that these policies work well, and voters can see that themselves, and they see them work, and they keep supporting them. And there was a recent article, I'll try to dig up the link, that showed levels of support post enactment, and it goes up or stays exactly where it is. So for me, the proof's in the pudding. If these policies are bad, then voters would want to reverse them, and we see literally none of that.
Yeah, no, I would just echo. I mean, what we've seen in states that have passed legalization is support goes up, right? In Colorado, we won with 55% of the state, and now I think it's close to 70% of the state supports legalization. So I think, states are supportive of these, and really surrounding states are starting to pay attention. When you talk to people in Iowa and they say, well, Illinois is legalizing it, and it looks like there's a lot of jobs, and we're hearing positive things come out of there. It's very influential to those current prohibitionist states.
Yeah, I'd add, there was a YouGov poll where they asked people in legalization states, do you think it's been a success or a failure, or more of a success or more of a failure? And in every single legalization state, there was at least a 2-to-1 margin where people thought cannabis legalization was more of a success than a failure. The highest percent that thought it was more of a failure was only 20%. And a lot of the success numbers were well above 60 or 70%. I also just put a link in the comments section with rebuttals on traffic and crime. Overall, it's kind of mixed data on legalization. States, if crime and traffic are up or down, it's about even overall. There's as many states where there's a reduction in traffic fatalities as there are with increase. Obviously, there are many, 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 many factors that go into it. There's no reason to think legalization is a factor, but the result hasn't been that there's been an increase in either of those things. And when it comes to teen marijuana use, there is a lot of before and after data that shows that there's no increase in teen marijuana use after legalization, and in some cases it's actually down.
Great. So going in order of how I'm seeing these, and let's go through these quickly because I think we've only got a few minutes left, but can the industry put any major push behind New York in the next month? Karen, is that something you want to speak to?
Yeah, the people in industry that I've talked to, think there's not a huge chance of it passing. There is an organized industry group in the state. I'd suggest connecting with them so you can coordinate your efforts with them. But it seems like with or without a push, it's pretty slim chance that it'll happen. But I can connect. I saw and sent a private message to the person that sent that message, and we'll connect them with other industry folks that are organizing so they can, work together if they so choose.
Great. This one's probably for Brian. Has there been any indication as to whether Colorado will make online and phone ordering and curbside pickup permanent?
We have not had any sort of positive indication there. Well, honestly, we haven't had indication one way or another. But I do think, we're in very close contact with the governor's office. The governor's just been wonderful on this issue. And, he's shown that he can get things done quickly when need be. So I would be surprised if that was rolled back. I would note that the legislature in Colorado is in session, I think, as of today. So there may be, this may be a good time to kind of get in touch and monitor that and contact your elected officials to make sure those changes remain in place.
All right. What about Texas? Karen, I'll leave that one to you.
Sure. So Texas's legislature is only in session every 2 years. It'll be in session next year. The lieutenant governor has a tremendous amount of power in the Senate. He blocked decriminalization last year, and he also blocked expanding medical cannabis. There is a very limited low THC program for medical cannabis with 3 total businesses in the entire state. Maybe it'll get expanded next year, but the popular wisdom is, with this lieutenant governor, unless he has a change of heart, it's going to be very, very slow progress.
Great. And I will say, I know, because we've been working in Texas a bit, there are some really great advocates on the ground there that are doing a lot of legwork right now, a lot of organizing, a lot of events in local communities, trying to build up a coalition so that come 2021, there will be a good effort there to make that push for medical and hopefully for adult use as well. Let's see. I don't quite understand that one, so I'm going to skip it for now. Minnesota only has 8 dispensaries, and I have disabilities that cannot drive. They've added to that in the last session, but we still have not heard anything about where they're going to be. Do you know when they might be making decisions in Minnesota? Do we know any of the details there?
That I don't know. Our allies, Sensible Minnesota, have been playing a leading role in trying to expand medical cannabis there, so they would probably be the best folks to ask that. They'd be plugged in there.
We've got, well, one person, there's a question mark on here, but it looks like a statement regarding delivery in Massachusetts and social equity applicants, but that leads into the next question about racial equity or economic justice in cannabis. In what ways are organizations working to raise the bar for provisions protecting poor people and people of color?
Sure,
and
I can
go. Yeah, Karen, go ahead, and then Brian can talk about what VS is doing.
Great. So we've been really proud of the bill in Illinois that we played a leading role in that kind of set a new bar for social justice. There are 3 pieces that we try to get included very hard in every law that's passing now on legalization. One is expungement or resentencing. Another is inclusion in the industry to make sure that there's diversity in the cannabis industry. And then the final one is having a portion of the funding go to those communities or individuals that were most hard hit by the war on drugs. And a lot of laws go beyond that too. So in Illinois, we've got a summary of all the social justice provisions on our site. How that worked essentially is all the medical cannabis businesses paid an enormous fee to be licensed as adult use. Then that money went in to essentially subsidize social equity applicants, and all new licenses, 20% of the total points that can be granted on applications are for if an applicant is a social equity license. So that's one of the many things that law did to promote inclusion. Other laws, bills that we're working in, like in Connecticut, took a different approach, but the overall goal is to make sure those 3 things are have meaningful, robust provisions.
Yeah, and I would say there's sort of 2 primary pieces here. I mean, one is what Karen spoke about, which is how do we address inclusion in the regulatory market and the business market. But then I think there are obviously longstanding issues regarding criminal justice and the effect on individuals of color or younger people, poorer people, people that are disproportionately impacted. And there's a lot of work going on. We're supporting some of that work. Some wonderful work's being done by the Last Prisoner Project, if anyone wants to Google that. But there's a lot of movement around expungement, trying to work through, we're working in Colorado, but there's other states that are addressing the issue of how do we, clean up people's records. California's done a great job on this, that have had, basically that were arrested for something that is no longer a crime, right? Now that we've legalized marijuana, how do we get that off their record so it's not preventing them from getting jobs and so forth? There's also fascinating efforts going on right now in certain cities across the country to simply stop marijuana arrests. I think Columbus, Ohio, Atlanta, that are really, they're trying not to introduce people into the criminal justice system currently because of the COVID crisis. I mean, essentially, if you end up in jail right now, it could be a death sentence, right? And a lot of, hundreds of thousands of arrests around the country every year are for marijuana, right? So how do we sort of cease that at the moment? So, and we've been working a bit and communicating with, public defenders and others that are just simply trying to get people out of jail, particularly those that are in there for nonviolent crimes like marijuana. During the COVID crisis, obviously being in jail could be a death sentence. I mean, it's, that virus has spread, and there's been a lot of movement in Cincinnati and other places across the country to really try to address that issue.
I'll just also mention VS was working on an expungement bill in Colorado that's basically like most legislation come to a halt as the legislature has been out for the last several weeks and is only returning to deal with the budget. So that's kind of fallen by the wayside. And VS also has worked with the city of Denver on their expungement record sealing program with a bunch of attorneys volunteering on weekends to do clinics to help people with sealing their records. We got a couple more questions if we want to just hang on. See if we can answer them. There's a question about where folks can find the data for tax revenue collected in legal states to provide to their state and local officials. I'll just quickly say there is no one place to look. I would say the Marijuana Policy Project is probably the best resource overall. If you go on their website, there's a resources section, and just you'll find probably under legalization, I think there'll be stuff about revenue and economic impacts, and they've done a good job of compiling a lot of that data. But it's changing constantly, and it's in states around the country, so it's really difficult to really keep it all in one place and keep it all up to date. I don't know if anyone else has any other good ideas on that.
It's also not like I was gonna say it's not apples to oranges, right? These states all have different schemes, and so it makes it difficult to just kind of compare it all nice and simply for a voter or a legislator. But yeah, I'll pass the mic to Karen.
I just put a link in the comments that has year after year revenue in every state, and it says what the tax rate is. Obviously, slower implementation, areas of prohibition is going to reduce revenue, but the numbers are there.
Great. Does anyone on the panel know the status of the court cases in Florida regarding legislation there?
Some of them, not all the details. I know there was litigation about licensing, and I feel like I saw it was advancing. Do you guys, Brian, do you know?
Yeah, we've been following some of the never-ending litigation in Florida. Probably the most seminal case is the Flora-grown case, which apparently will be decided in the next month or two. I don't know if things have been slowed down due to COVID, but there's been challenges to the licensing regime. There's been challenges to the vertically integrated proponents of that law, which right now everyone's required to be vertically integrated. And my guess is we'll see some more clarity in the next couple months, particularly in the Flora-grown case.
Awesome. Well, I think we've gone about an hour, so if anyone has any additional questions, please feel free to contact the folks who participate in the panel. I'd like to thank Brian, Karen, and Matt for joining us and sharing their expertise, and of course Vicente Sederberg and the Marijuana Policy Project for co-hosting this webinar. And we hope to come back and do another one next year about all the laws that are on their way towards passing. But in the meantime, we encourage everyone to help out however you can, support the Marijuana Policy Project and the great work that they're doing.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Mason.